Okay, we're going to get started. Firstly, thank you everyone for coming to this event this evening. This is the first edition of the second season of Free Speech Champions drop-in events. And the drop-in events are essentially an opportunity for us to host public conversations about the free speech issues and the free speech questions of our time. And for anyone who doesn't know, Free Speech Champions is an exciting project which supports young people to stand up for free speech, to understand why free speech is important, and to campaign for it, meet new people, and really engage young people and students in free speech questions of today. And so, as the title says, are we free to disagree? How to disagree in the age of conformity, how to debate in the age of conformity. And the reason why we're hosting this event, particularly as the first edition of the second series, is because many people for years now have been going on about the free speech problems on campus, but rather than the problem really improving, we seem like every single day, every week, we have new stories, new controversies around free speech on campus. And it often seems to be taking many different forms. So a few years ago, the whole debate was very much about no platforming, but now we're seeing these new different issues emerging, whether that's questions around 30% of students and young people self-censoring their opinions, campaigns of intimidation and harassment of academics for having opinions and views that are widely held but don't necessarily conform to a particular orthodoxy. On campus, we hear about training of students and academics into particular ways of thinking, not engaging in discussion and debate, but training people to think a particular way, and a kind of general chilling atmosphere around discussions around different issues that are in the public conversation, whether that's around populism and Brexit and Trump to gender, race, and questions of identity. And so on this event, we really want to understand both what the problem is and engage in these conversations about how we tease out what the problem is, but to really go further than that. And I think this is why this particular event is different from the ones that we've done before, which is usually a panel discussion in a very traditional way, and we open it up to the floor. But this event, we really want it to be oriented towards acting in the world, oriented towards what can we really do? How do we organize? How do we collaborate with one another in order to find responses and solutions to ensure that campus life and intellectual life is the way that it was meant to be, which is open, free, and engaging in the pursuit of truth and knowledge in a way that is free from intimidation. And so I'm really, really excited for the panel that we have today, because what's really interesting and I think unique about this panel today is that they all come from a range of different perspectives and have different experiences and stories, which I think can really illuminate what the issues are. And just the format for this event, it'll be a kind of in conversation for the first half an hour or so, and then we will open it up as usual to the floor. And so without any further ado, I will introduce this fantastic panel. We firstly have, in no particular order, Dr. Neil Finn. He's a senior lecturer in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh, focusing on happiness and social quality. We have Professor Ellie Lee, who's a professor of family and parenting research at the University of Kent and director of the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies. We also have Charlie Peters, who is a Mail Plus columnist and broadcaster and commentates on many different important issues that we have in society today. And we also have Sam Bayliss, who is the co-convener of this panel event. Also, he's a student at the University of Edinburgh, and he is also a free speech champion, which is one of the members of this organisation, Free Speech Champions. And so I'm going to, I guess, get straight into it. And I think I'm going to go to you, Dr. Neil Finn, first, because I think that, as I mentioned in the introduction, when we talk about the free speech problems on campus, we often hear about no platforming. We hear no platforming of controversial figures, and a lot of the debate is often skewed in that direction. But actually what's really interesting, I think, and important about your story is that it shows how a different way in which kind of free speech is chilled, that doesn't necessarily involve no platforming or cancelling people, but it's a seemingly more subtle and insidious way. And I think for those who don't know a bit about your story, it'd be really great if you can kind of tell us in very brief what happened, if you don't mind, and what you think the impact and effects of what happened is on campus.
So yeah, I'll try and keep it brief because it's sort of complicated. But sort of the background is I've been a lecturer at Edinburgh for 35 years and never had a spot of significant bother of any sort. I'm not a controversialist. I teach on relatively politically anodyne topics, actually, mainly on happiness and sustainable development. So I don't kind of walk into trouble willingly. But suddenly in April, there was a very, very short episode, a flurry of online mobbing, which people made me aware of. It was incredibly sudden and short-lived. It was over within 2-3 days. It was nothing like what, for example, Kathleen Stock has experienced. There was really, I will never know how many people were involved, probably just a handful. They were organized. But my goodness, they went for the jugular. Within a couple of days, I was being called a racist and a misogynist and a transphobe and a bigot and a rape apologist and just all round a crusty old man, an all round bad guy. And students were claiming that they were triggered, traumatized by my tweets, and then some of them said they were traumatized by my lectures. I'd never heard anything about this. And the weirdest thing was that none of these mainly anonymous people, so who are all strangers to me, it was an odd year, obviously, COVID happening. So I hadn't taught on campus for a year and a half. So none of them, I don't think, knew me personally. But none of them thought to kind of send me an email or send me a question, or even none of them even addressed me on Twitter. So there was no Twitter storm even. It was very, very strange. So I suppose in terms of free speech, nobody actively tried to stop my free speech directly, other than saying that I should be withdrawn from the teaching staff, or at the very least re-educated. And then there was the usual ritualistic stuff, I ought to apologize, but nobody was able to explain actually what I should apologize for, other than the fact that my very mild, and in my view, very non-controversial questioning of some forms of social activism. I had questioned, for example, racial segregation on campus. Is that a good idea? Is it going to lead to better race relations? I had questioned whether withdrawing all men from the public arena after 6 o'clock in the evenings is going to make for greater women's safety. So these were mild questions, but people claimed to be traumatized and made to feel unsafe by them. And then it was followed by a 2-month investigation based on nothing, because there was no complaint made about me. That's the weirdest thing as well. There was a big formal investigation, but not a single formal complaint even. So I was suspended from all student-facing activities. So altogether a bit Kafkaesque and mildly traumatic, but mainly puzzling for me. I mean, really, really puzzling. And I actually brought a quote. Do you mind if I just read out a quote, just if I'm very, very quick with this? Because I think it's quite instructive for this evening's. So I'll actually even hold it up. Can you read? So
yeah, read it out.
Is that the right way around? It's not. Yeah, I'm not seeing it, so I'm going to have to read it. This is not an attempt. So this is from an email that one of the students recommended as a template email for students to send in to my head of department. This is not an attempted cancellation or a denial of free speech, nor do we wish to attack Neil's character. Now, I thought that was a bit, when I finally saw this thing, which was shown to me at one stage during the investigation, I thought that was a little bit weird, because what is calling people all those names and telling them that they don't fit in the university and that they should withdraw? What is that other than a cancellation? So on the one hand, it was a very concerted attack, but on the other hand, these people knew that what they were doing was wrong, and they knew that it didn't have a good optic, and so they claimed it wasn't a cancellation. So if you remember Magritte's picture, this is ceci n'est pas une pipe, this is not a pipe, with a picture of a pipe. That's what that was a little bit like. It was a cancellation that wasn't a cancellation.
And you mentioned that there was a formal investigation. I mean, so how did the university respond? I mean, do you feel like they emboldened or supported you? What did you think about their response?
Well, again, it was mixed messages. So, on the one hand, terribly kind. Even the people that were investigating me, very supportive and kind of offering me therapy and things. And I was saying, well, thanks, but no thanks. I'm troubled and I'm very angry. But no, I just want this to be sorted and I would like to meet with these people and talk it through because conversation can work wonders in solving what seem to be political differences but actually aren't.
Mm.
And that was denied to me. Instead, there was this very formal investigation, which, as I say, felt Kafkaesque. So, on the one hand, the university seemed to be and lots of people, including very, very senior people across the university, quickly got in touch. Neil, are you okay? Is everything fine? What can we do to support you? Well, great, but there was no formal public statement that I'd done nothing wrong. And in a way, the message was the obverse of that. If you investigate somebody and withdraw them for 2 months and withdraw them for teaching, it makes it look as though you think that that person must have done something pretty awful.
Mm.
So I think even my best friends probably wondered, has Neil gone and said something? Has he done a really off-taste joke or has he done something really bad? And then finally I was exonerated, but even then, no statement about the exoneration, no kind of press release saying, we've investigated Neil Finn, it was all fine, it was just a misunderstanding, he didn't say anything bad, he's a good lecturer. Something simple like that would have done, but no, it was just silence.
One of the things that you hear, because what was quite striking about your case was that there was a strong media reaction. So the press covered it, there was a strong public support for you. And some of the critics will say, oh, well, how can this be that bad? Because actually, look, the entirety of the press really, really backed him. But what do you think about that in terms of the impact that has on campus when these things happen? Because people just look on the outside and think, oh, he was supported, it clearly wasn't that bad. But do you think there is an effect that this actually has on campus, on academics?
Yeah. So I'll tell you what I think, what the optimist in me hopes and tries to believe. I think that press coverage, which, as you say, it was very, very supportive. I mean, at my last count, there was sort of 30 to 40 different press outlets, all saying it's clear that he's done nothing wrong, what's happening here, why hasn't the university stood by him? So I felt supported by that. And I think the university might have conducted its investigation for a lot longer. The pattern in universities, if a staff member is investigated and withdrawn, it tends to take 6 months to a year. And Edinburgh got it through in 2 months. And maybe they wouldn't have done that if they hadn't seen that very supportive coverage. I also hope that people across the university saw that and recognized that at the very least, whoever it was who organized this cancellation attempt were fundamentally at odds with the British public. People don't look at tweets of the kind that I wrote and think this is a madman or this is somebody who isn't in line with the views of anthropology. Sensible people don't draw those conclusions. So I hope that people will have drawn a lesson that actually activists on campus can end up in these echo chambers, which puts them fundamentally at odds with the rest of the population. And that's maybe not a good thing in the long run.
Mm. And Professor Ellie Lee, I mean, Dr. Neil's kind of talked about the fact that these activists are sometimes at odds with the mainstream population, but the reality is they can still create this culture on campus that has real effects both on academics and students. And I mean, so what do you think about that kind of context that's being cultivated amongst campus life?
Well, I think it's a big problem. I mean, in response to the issues that I've been trying to raise at the university where I work, where there's been this program introduced for students, an online training program called Expect Respect, where they're asked to essentially absorb and embrace the tenets of gender theory and critical race theory. which I've contested the university doing this. The thing that's become increasingly apparent about it is that the way this seems to work is through a small number of students who are the people who are involved with the student union, really, working with some members of management or certain sections of the administration at the university to develop these things, really very separately from the academic staff in general, certainly very separately from most students. I don't know whether he's here, but there's a colleague at UCL called Alan Sokal, who's taken the time to write a very thorough critique of the way this has worked at my university, which is published on ARIO. You know, and he makes the point in it that university administration takes the student union as its primary interlocutor. And in most cases, that union is run by a minority of activists, since they're the only students who are willing to devote so much time and energy away from their studies and social pursuits. And I think that's true. And I do think that we've ended up very unfortunately with this activist group of students who hold very strong opinions on things and are very, in a way which isn't generally prone to having reasonable discussion, with a management that wants to tick a lot of boxes, but I think doesn't have very much commitment to anything very much, and a turning away from any type of more open or more democratizing, for want of a better word, engaging, involving attempt to create a genuine culture of academic freedom on campuses. And I think that's the problem. And I think it's a huge problem. I think it's only going to be resolved if more members of academic staff start trying to live academic freedom, not just see it as a policy that's somewhere there within university paperwork, because all universities have them. But instead, I think staff have to take it on themselves to make this real and make campuses places where there is a genuine discussion within classrooms, outside classrooms. I think there needs to be the creation of a different culture, because at the moment it's so that dimension of things is so, it's collapsing very rapidly on campuses, I think. And what you've got above it is this dance between management and certain activists pursuing things in a particular direction. My experience of it has been actually that it's harder than you think to create a reaction around it and make a debate happen. So it's a funny thing, because obviously some people are becoming real targets for cancel culture in this horrible sort of way. But otherwise, if you want to make it your business to turn academic freedom into a cause on campus and find ways of getting people to understand the problem, that's actually really quite difficult, I'm finding.
Well, it is part of the challenge with that, because this is happening and perhaps embedded in a wider cultural problem. So one of the reasons why these particular activists are able to really gain a lot of traction is because their ideas are being promoted in many different institutions, not just the university campus. Because perhaps if it was a minority of students around a different issue, then they may not get that traction. So do you see it as something localized on campus, or actually a wider cultural challenge around free speech and academic freedom?
No, it's undoubtedly much wider. I mean, I think that's one reason why I don't really, I mean, there's some people who argue that, you know, the problem is the Marxist or left or whatever they want to call it takeover of campuses, as if there's this, you know, really sort of organized, powerful thing, ideologically driven thing going on that's sweeping across campuses. And I don't see that as the way it's working. I think it is much wider. I suppose one way that I would look at it is that I think that, you know, I was reflecting on it, thinking back when I was an undergraduate, which was about 30 years ago, so it's quite a long time ago. But the sorts of activists that were around on campus then, they were. I'm not saying that I agreed with things that they argued, but they were political parties who were arguing a program or an outlook there wasn't really identity politics, if you like, in the way that there is now. And I think that one of the things that's happened in the intervening period is the kind of disintegration and reorganization of that aspect of our lives in a wider sense. I think if you look at more generally what's happened to political life, its transformation into technocracy, and the therefore disintegration of an attempt to have people think of themselves as people that need to fit in with a wider set of ideas, or have a political program or a view about how the world might be that they want to argue for. That's been replaced with something much more subjectivized, something much more incoherent. And I think that's much more general than something that's just happened on campuses, even though you can see it perhaps more clearly at universities.
And Charlie, I mean, you were active on campus when you were a student before you graduated a couple of years ago. Could you tell me a bit more about that experience? Because it is interesting that, you know, Sam, you are a student currently, and this, what's it really like from the perspective of when you're actually there as a student rather than an academic or an outsider, to which you are more now?
Well, I turned up at Edinburgh in 2015, and most of my activism took place from my bedroom. So I wouldn't say it was like I was walking around campus, putting up posters, knocking on doors and signing petitions. Although I did write a letter in one of the kind of maybe the third or fourth week of my time at university. I wrote a letter to the student union, so you could tell I was a real cool guy, right? Basically saying that the safe space and no platform policies had to go, and they weren't particularly good. And when I wrote this letter, I put it on a petition website. It got well over 1,000 signatures in about a week. I have to conclude that that was a global petition, so it wasn't just Edinburgh students, although dozens, we're talking dozens of Edinburgh students did in fact sign it. But I found, just in terms of my experiences, well, there were lots of people on my side, as it were, who were in favour of more free speech on campus, who were opposed to censorship and no platform policies, etc. We were also a very small number, just as there is a tiny minority leading this charge of censorship. And maybe other people in the school will have this experience, but most students just want to go to university for 3 years, get a degree and go on a few nice nights out and have a good time and enjoy the freedom of youth. They don't necessarily want to spend years engaging with kind of student union apparatchiks and votes on rainy midweek nights about various policies that could affect freedom of speech on campus. You actually just want to have a nice time at university, and generally speaking, getting involved in student politics is not a good way to have a nice time, regardless of which side that you belong to. It is an extreme, I would say it's some of the worst experiences I've had in my life, and I've been deployed as a soldier, so I would say really don't recommend it. It's a real 0 out of 10. So are we gonna, I would love, as Ellie talks about, fostering a kind of a culture in favor of freedom of speech on campus. Ellie, what a dream. I spent a lot of time trying to secure that. Don't think it's gonna happen. Instead, this discussion tonight is about actions, not just the ideas I expect we all kind of broadly agree with. To act on this, you basically need to legally or practically threaten the tiny minority that causes a lot of these problems with serious repercussions. And if you don't threaten them directly, you threaten them indirectly through the university administration. You say, if you launch campaigns against academics such as Dr. Neil, then you are conducting a harassment campaign, and we kick you out of university and you find it tough to get a job. If you are an academic and you call for another academic to be silenced, you lose your paycheck. You know, that is actually how you achieve these things. That is how you react against, generally speaking, like leftist agitation. You don't just say, let's win the hearts and minds of our opposition. Let's try and get more people on our side. Because no matter how much shouting you do, they'll probably shout a little bit louder, and they are generally in control of the decision-making bodies. So threaten them with something more impressive. One of the questions in the chat, sorry, just to go on about this very briefly, is about what do I think about the academic free speech bill? We can go on to that later, but I think government is essentially probably the best vehicle for achieving this. Government can kind of achieve the satisfactory threat over student unions and university administration that might actually have more of an effect on creating a culture of free speech than us winning over a few others. I know Ellie will disagree with me on this.
Ellie, you're shaking your head. What do you make of what Charlie's just said?
Well, I think I mean, you know, we can have a discussion about the conceptual difference between free speech and academic freedom. I mean, to me, you can't be an academic and not live academic freedom. I mean, it just makes no sense, because the whole content of the profession and its responsibility is to pursue the truth. I mean, that's definitionally what it is you're trying to do. You're trying to work out problems, and that absolutely has to involve opening issues up to interrogation. So it's inherent to the life of the academic to be freely pursuing discussion and ideas. And that's what I'm saying, is that I think that's, you know, and I think actually lots of students want to do this, you know, and so I don't think it's true to say that, you know, it's just a pain and unpleasant being involved in this. It's actually becoming an educated person is to be involved in this enterprise. And I think that you know, probably the single biggest problem in my mind about university life at the moment is that, well, too few academics are doing this at all. And where they are doing it, they're refusing to publicly defend their responsibilities as academics. So it's really a failure of the profession, which I think is central to this specific problem on campus. And you can see it with what happened to Castock. I mean, you know, management came to say something decent very late in the day, leaving her to fry for 3 years. And what were her colleagues doing? I mean, I know ones that were completely on the other side, who were involved in fostering a culture of harassment. But there were plenty of people who didn't want to do that, but they didn't do the other thing either, which is to say something. But it's more just in terms of the ordinary, everyday generality of academic life and what it should be like, you know, what it means to live an academic life. I think that is being lost in universities. They're becoming places which are very estranged from that, or indifferent to it, or not very interested in it. That's what I think management's like. I don't think they're actually very interested in it, or certainly not the university where I work. They see it as neither here nor there, you know, they're not bothered by it.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to Charlie and Dr. in a sec, but Sam, I just want to bring you in, because you're a student right now, and so, you know, what does it feel like from your perspective? And you also have experiences, you know, in terms of free speech on campus, and do you think it's just a matter of, you know, don't get involved because just get on with your 3 years because, you know, these are just stupid activists? Or do you think we have a responsibility to do something to preserve academic life? What are your thoughts?
So I think when I look at my my final year at university now, when I look back, there are numerous occasions and events where I've realized that kind of the deterioration of discourse at higher education is fully in action. So, for example, you look at an email that all of us English literature students received last year, asking us to sign an open letter to the English department to decolonize the curriculum. You know, this is a conversation that is perfectly valid and needs to happen. But this email said, quote, "You do not need to read the entire letter to sign it." And so, you know, that's you know, one particular example of, you know, just the complete utter disregard of critical thinking, which is exactly what we should be, you know, trying to foster and encourage amongst our institutions of higher education. You know, you look at, for instance, the David Hume Tower affair at the University of Edinburgh, where you know, this university building was renamed after David Hume was effectively, was labelled a racist. And yes, the footnote in his essay was unequivocally racist. But again, you know, you look at what happened then. There was a petition with 1,700 signatures. There are, as Neil said, 45,000 undergraduates at the University of Edinburgh. and the tower was renamed. The original petition calling for it to be renamed asked for it to be renamed the Julius Nyerere Tower. And Julius Nyerere was also an Edinburgh graduate, but president of Tanzania. He was also a rampant homophobe and had ties to dictatorships. So, you know, once again, you know, you can just imagine some student Googling Edinburgh alumni and finding Julius Nyerere as the first person of color and jumping that straight into their petition. It screams, as I say, a deterioration of discourse and a retreat from critical thinking. With regards to what you say, you know, is it a case of is just don't get involved and have fun for 3 years? You know, there have been a couple of occasions where I think that might have been a path to take. But I do think that we absolutely have a duty to do our bit for academic freedom and free speech on campus, because you know, we are witnessing, as the panel has alluded to, the chilling effect of self-censorship on campus, where numerous people come to me and say that they haven't raised a point in a tutorial or a seminar or a lecture because, you know, they're genuinely concerned about the social consequences of them saying this. And so it's our duty to try and foster the value of freedom of speech and to really promote it, because otherwise, yeah, we resort to well, I fear for the world in the working world into which all us undergraduates are going to be entering.
Yeah, and Nathan, do you think that some of what Charlie was saying about kind of threatening those students and really putting strong consequences of them would have helped in your case? Because I have heard that argument made that actually we need to basically have a zero tolerance approach to certain forms of behavior on campus. What do you make of that argument?
So my view on that has actually changed, mellowed over the last few months. At no stage did I call for anyone to be penalized or even threatened with punishments, and I stand by that. I've mellowed to the extent that whereas in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, I felt really, really rough. I thought you know, you wake up at night having traumas, you know, it's horrid. It's horrid having a bunch of people that profess to hate you quite so much. And so your gut reaction is to want harm back. But no, I mean, in terms of what's the best thing to do about it, I don't think threats of punishments are really going to make much difference. I think you know, free speech is an important thing to defend, but it's much more interesting and much more life enhancing to actually go ahead and just make good use of your free speech. The best way we can fight intolerance is by having fun and having good, bright, curious conversations with people. So in terms of repair work since the attacks on me, I mean, I would like to thank really, really from the bottom of my heart, Sam and his friends Daniel and Rob, who very quickly got in touch, and about 50 to 60 other students across the university, most of them strangers to me, who got in touch with just really, really decent, loving messages. Without them, without those students, and of course I had lots of staff saying similar stuff too, which was nice, but the students saying stuff they didn't need to, it meant an absolutely enormous amount to me, and made me really want to carry on, because otherwise you just, even though it might only be 5 or 10 activists, you very quickly think, oh, they must be typical of the student body. And as Sam just said, there's 45,000 students. Probably most of them just want to keep their heads down, keep out of trouble. But as I say, I forget how many, but 40 to 50 really brave, decent souls took the trouble to get in touch with me, a stranger to them. So if you see people being mobbed in your university, do the same as they did. It really, really matters. It's just showing that you care, showing that you count.
And what are your thoughts on some of the points that have been made, Professor Ellie Lee?
What, any of them? I mean, on the idea of, I suppose I do think that as part of adult responsibility, academic responsibility at universities, I don't think that students should be able to behave like complete idiots and going around harassing people and making their life misery. And I think that words should be had with them, most definitely, by the people that run universities. And I think that, you know, Sussex has been way too soft on some of the students and let things go far too far. And I think, you know, it just needs to be explained to anybody that this is not behaviour which is the sort of thing that is what should happen at an institute of higher education. It's completely out, it's without the way things should go on, you know, in terms of disciplining people and, you know, taking away their university place or something like that. I mean, clearly that would be an absolute last resort. But I don't think, you know, in Sussex, there's been this argument mounted that, you know, that they're expressing their free speech and their freedom to protest as if that's equivalent to Cath Stott making her case. I don't think that's true. I don't think they are equivalent. And I think that it needs to be understood that what she was doing is entirely in line with the objectives of academic life, and, you know, saying silly, unpleasant things about people on and on and on isn't. But I think it comes down to the same thing. I think that staff have got to grow a pair, for want of a better word, and start, you know, making it clear what university life is about and the brilliant thing about it, the opportunity. Because the thing is that academic freedom and free speech are brilliant things. I mean, they, you know, they're really, really important because they're what can drive us forward in terms of our understanding of the world. You know, they increase our humanity. They make it possible for us to be better people in the world. It's really the key to us being better people, is learning how to speak freely and relate to others with tolerance and take other people seriously and argue accordingly. And I think that's, you know, that's the problem. I don't think that asking the government to do something about this is any solution at all myself. And I also actually don't trust them as far as I can throw them with this bill, given the fact what they're doing with the online harms bill at the same time. I think the government is completely untrustworthy. And I would rather rely on my colleagues to create a culture on campus which improves the situation than look to government myself.
And how would you respond to that, Charlotte? Because I think some people do worry that that we do go to disciplining and you know, harsh, that could actually be quite counterproductive and actually can foster a kind of sense of authoritarianism, and we do need to ultimately win the argument for it to continue in the long term. I mean, do you really see some of the things that you mentioned as getting to the heart of what the problem is?
Yes. At the moment, I don't think people in our university administrations have any incentive whatsoever to fight for our side. What do they get backing us? I mean, Dr. Neil Thin is a wonderful researcher. He has worked at the university for 35 years. He's given decades of service to students and academia. Like thousands of students have benefited from his work. And he's a very, very nice guy. So much of a nice guy that even when someone injures him as much as these people have, he has no interest in carrying out revenge. This is all very lovely, but it doesn't help us to prevent them from doing it again. I think that the problem with kind of classical liberals and kind of free speech liberals in general is that you're all kind of too nice. And I'm in favor of authoritarianism because I want to destroy the enemies who seek to ruin academic freedom on campus. I have no qualms about saying this. These are bad people who need to be punished. And at the moment, the universities have no incentive whatsoever to punish them. Okay, let's think about Dr. Neil Thin, for example, right? What are the incentives for them to back Dr. Neil Thin? Lofty ideas about academic freedom. Wouldn't it be nice for academics to take freedom seriously and for us to cultivate a climate of discussion? These are all lovely, brilliant things, but there's no actual incentive for doing this. By contrast, their incentive for not giving into the academics is to receive even more abuse, perhaps for them to be targeted as well. If they ignore the mob, then they also might face its wrath. And so you can create incentives the other way and say, if you fail to punish the mob, we will punish you. if you don't react against violence, or kind of campaigns of harassment, if you excuse it once, you excuse it 1,000 times, and universities have already excused so many of these instances. So while I'm totally in favour of creating a culture of academic freedom, and let's all bandy together and create this atmosphere of lofty ideals and discussion, we are not going to get there if the people who destroy it get away with it every time.
And Dr. Nilton and Professor, because in some ways Charlie's argument is a compelling one, that actually this has been a problem that has been building for decades. Actually, this idea that we can kind of create this culture when actually this orthodoxy is very much up on the ascendancy, very much becoming institutionalized, and is incredibly powerful to such an extent that people's lives are being damaged. Like, Kathleen Stock having to actually leave her institution, and many other people are experiencing that also. When you talk about adult authority, actually maybe that authority is just saying, this is unacceptable, that there's going to be consequences for your actions, and this has got to stop. And actually sometimes we do spend a lot of time, trying to intellectualize and philosophize about it, but ultimately the best way to stop it is to put a fundamental end to it by some kind of serious penalty. Can you see why that argument is a compelling one?
So am I on mute, or am I unmuted?
No. Go for it.
So so it's fairly compelling. I just don't think it's going to do as much good in the long run as having conversations. I'm a great fan of grown-up conversations. If people, let's be brutally honest. Students who join mobbing campaigns of naive cancer culture, they're not behaving in very grown-up ways. Most of them just haven't thought it through. They've added their name. They've sent out a quick message on social media or something. They haven't thought it through. They're probably off to another party, So I'm with Ellie. They absolutely do need to be brought into a conversation. And in fact, universities, by not bringing them into a conversation, are really letting them down. All I'm saying is conversation is our way forward, and also setting a really good example, saying, all right, so we can actually talk about these difficult issues in mind-altering, conversation-moving ways. And if we we demonstrate that, that's the best way of defending free speech, not by threatening punishments. But I'm a conciliatory thing, though. I do think, as a last resort, when people, what people did to Kathleen Stock was unforgivable. It really was awful. So they really did to be told, if you do anything like that again, then we will actually take action, because you clearly don't belong in a community if you're going to sabotage your community in that way.
Mm-hmm. But were you going to pick up, Ellie?
Yeah, I was just looking in the chat. Stephen Greer's talking about what's happening to him. So hopefully that can be brought into the conversation as well. Don't get me wrong, Charlie, I'm not saying be soft. I'm saying the opposite. I think the problem, you see, to me, to genuinely live a life where you believe in academic freedom and to act with tolerance does mean making some very hard points to people and saying things to them when what they're doing is completely mindless and ridiculous and unacceptable. And that needs to be said, so, I would hope if anything ever happened where I work in the way that it had to Kathleen Stott, that I would actually really want to go for the students concerned and have it out with them. I'm not saying just leave them, don't do anything. I'm saying I think it is the responsibility of people who work on campuses to make this happen.
No,
I don't agree with saying, let's ask the government to do it for us. I think we have to make our campuses places where academic life can thrive.
I agree, but you're not going to do that, I don't think, through essentially having more conversations with people who are incredibly motivated to destroy you. Are we free to disagree? I think we are, but it takes quite a lot of hard work to change these minds. So much hard work that I don't think it's really particularly possible. You might say, XYZ, well, here's a thing, academic freedom, have you heard of it? It's jolly good. And they might listen to you, but they'll also say, what about racism, sexism, transphobia, misogyny, etc.? And they will say that while academic freedom is important, it is not as important as protecting people from the violence of your ideas, etc., etc. I think while your approach, maybe soft was the wrong term. I think it's very generous. It's extremely generous to think that, and perhaps actually quite a little bit kind of arrogant to say that you might be able to change their minds, because it's been the best part of a decade now since we kind of adopted this campus culture in a very extreme way. And in that time, we've kind of lost nearly every single fight. Like, it's not going in our way in any measurable way whatsoever. There has been more no platforming, more censorship, more speech codes have developed, even as this has gathered more attention and there's been more discussion on it. So as the debate grows, as we confront these people, the problem gets worse. So I think
my point, Charlie, is that the reason why that has happened is because, very unfortunately, the academic community has put their head down and hoped it would go away, been cowardly in the face of it, not defended colleagues,
right,
not made the arguments. And I honestly don't think it's beyond us to do that.
But Ellie, is that going to change? Like, what I guess Charlie's saying, where's the incentive for that to change?
They have no reason to stick their head above the parapet if they're
academics have no reason to defend academic life, and it's fundamental tenets.
No, really, they don't. If the threat is you might end up like Kathleen Stockman, spend years of having your life threatened, your life and well-being threatened. Hey, I stick my head down. I'll be the first to admit it. I don't think I'm much of a coward, but I would prevent my life being ruined. So you can incentivize.
You're right, Charlie. Then we no longer have higher education. We have something else. We have kind of a playground with the government coming in and taking the nasty bullies out.
Well, that sounds
which isn't my idea of higher education.
That sounds like a good idea. Let all the people who want to do academic freedom stay on campus, and those who want to bully, threaten, intimidate, and harass, they can go to jail. That sounds great to me.
Okay. Well, I think there's a lot of points that have been raised, and I think we are beginning to get to perhaps the crux of how some of the challenges, whether or not we do need strong, forthright kind of government intervention because it's become so bad, or actually, Ellie's saying that there is the academics aren't speaking up, the management, but there's still questions as to how do we initiate those academics and the management to be more supportive of academic freedom and free speech. That's still an open question. We've kind of touched upon engaging with those students and helping them to understand why these things are important. But there is still a point, I think, that Charlie raised, that they are part of the cultural zeitgeist and orthodoxy, so they don't have an incentive to really listen because they might put forward, racism or whatever as being more important than academic freedom, and that does seem to be a wider problem. So I think we still really need to continue throughout this discussion to tease out what can really realistically be done. And I think that I really would like to bring in now some more people from the Free Speech Champions Project before I come to the wider audience to kind of talk about what they've been doing to cultivate this, and whether they think it's a success, whether they think it's what the response has been, and on what challenges they face. I think, Sophie, it'd be really great to hear from you as the kind of coordinator for the university's Free Speech Network, for the Free Speech Champions Project. I mean, I know it's very early days for you, but you obviously were the president of the Cambridge Radical Feminist Network. Like, how do you feel it's like actually organizing on the ground on your own with a couple of students and connecting to other people? What's that been like? And do you think it's been challenging or actually works?
Just to check, first of all, can you hear me okay and everything? Yeah. Okay, great. So I go back and forth on this one. I go back and forth on whether to be really optimistic or, quite pessimistic about the state of things in universities and within specifically the student population. So it's a question I got asked a lot when I started talking about this stuff, is whether it was a sort of vocal minority of people, and most people agree with free speech but are afraid, or whether people are apathetic or whatever else. And I don't have a kind of, perfect answer. I change my mind pretty regularly, but I do know that there's, at the very least, a significant minority of students on campus who still care very deeply about values like academic freedom and free speech. I think that there are lots of people like, I think it was Charlie who said, who just want to kind of, get on with it and not engage. And that's, pretty reasonable given the cost of engaging sometimes. And yeah, there are also I think a lot smaller than the people who kind of care about free speech, but a lot louder, that kind of minority of people who are just bullies. So it's an interesting environment to be in. I think there's huge reason for optimism, and just on the ground when you're making connections with people who are interested and who reach out to you. But I guess it comes down to a very similar issue that we've been talking about with the case of academics. Quite often the people who agree that academic freedom and free speech is important will sort of privately message you, but not be particularly willing to stick their necks out, I guess, publicly. And I think, I think that we have to do a lot more on campus to address that within the student population, and I think just as academics have a very specific responsibility to uphold academic freedom, because that's what gives them their legitimacy and their purpose to be there. And I think I agree with Ellie that it's other academics above all who actually need to step up and take that responsibility. I think that students also need to find a way of, of doing that, and of kind of doing that within the context of being students, and also wanting a life and everything. We need to create that culture for ourselves, and I think that over the next few years we're doing that.
But what made you feel confident though to do it? Because I think that is some of the thing. Is it because you have the odd student who's just got particular unique characteristics that enables them to transcend the problems, or do you think that there's something within all young people that could be part of the solution? Like what was it that really made you think that you needed to do something and to really get involved?
Well, I'm definitely not sort of some kind of special person who, with a unique personality trait that makes me particularly brave or whatever. I don't know what it was. I think I was probably one of those people who did believe quite strongly in free speech and academic freedom, but wasn't aware that there was a problem. Even, I assumed it was all kind of right-wing fear-mongering, or, that the free speech crisis was just this sort of manufactured thing, until I started saying things and then being surprised by the, vitriolic response and the total lack of, willingness to engaging in free speech and to engage with people you disagree with as human beings. And yes, to the chat, I did have a run-in with them. So I think a lot of people manage to go through their whole university life without ever having a run-in, and without ever having the brutality of it exposed. And maybe that's why it's easy to discount it until it happens to you.
And what do you think about that, Charlie? I mean, you also were someone that did get involved, or at least felt like you needed to do something. What made you think that you were the right person, or that you should do something?
Well, I just felt a natural opposition to what I discovered on paper when I turned up. I saw the nature of the policy and I thought, this is bad, this shouldn't exist. And despite a rather large amount of campaigning, it didn't change it, because there was a slightly bigger minority that was in opposition who wanted to keep it. So that was a frustration. But I think, my discovery of this problem as an issue was basically through just scrolling through the policies that were enacted to me by virtue of being a student at the University of Edinburgh, and spiked back in 2015 and gave me an opportunity to kind of argue against it, and that was brilliant. And got involved in the Free Speech University rankings and other kind of outlets that Spiked organises to take this on. But 6 years on, it's still very, very bad. And I'm no longer linked to the university, thank Christ, but it's gotten significantly worse in that time. You know, Dr. Neil's experiences are far beyond anything I could have possibly imagined when I was there. I mean, when I was 19 years old at Edinburgh, I was referred to in the kind of student newspapers as Edinburgh's resident libertarian. I'm not a libertarian anymore, but it was literally just me. He was saying, this isn't very good. And the kind of the reaction I got was mostly just kind of like jokes. Whereas Dr. Neil, for promoting similar kind of liberal ideas that I professed at the time, received a barrage of desecration, a constant stream of hate and a mob. If I'd endured that, I would have given up immediately. And so I'm glad that I continued campaigning while at university, but I know that if I'd faced what Dr. Neil had, I would have checked out very quickly.
I want to bring in the audience now, because I think that it is interesting that, you know, we are having these different ideas about what we think could be done. We kind of all agree that there's a problem, but there's different beliefs in terms of, do we have a responsibility? Do we just go in really hard? You know, how do we cultivate that solidarity between students and academics? You know, what do we really do? Because even with this project, the Free Speech Champions, we're organising, but we recognise that it is a big cultural problem. So it'd be great if people can raise their hand. There's a little function on there to be able to speak, because it'd be really great to hear other people's experiences and what they feel like would have really benefited them, either to stand up if they didn't stand up, or to support them if they were facing some kind of challenge on campus. So I'll go to Dylan Cade first.
Hi, and hi guys, thank you so much for coming to speak for us. It's been great so far. Lots of energy in this conversation. You can tell it's a really complicated issue, not always like easy to figure out what to do exactly. I mean, I was going to ask a couple questions, but I could also talk about the time that I saw on my campus when I was in college in the 3-4 years ago, when there was like one of these earlier social justice, air quotes, sort of movements. I remember as a student, like, even as someone who was really entrenched in like a history degree based in postmodern, post-colonial theory, it still struck me as like really strange and performative, theatrical, seeing what was going on my campus, in which a bunch of students accused a professor of being racist, and that professor was the dean of a humanities school. So it was a huge protest to recolonize a curriculum at a Jesuit Catholic liberal arts school. So, I mean, I guess my comment about it, in like setting aside everything about how I didn't really say anything publicly at all, I never would have stuck my head above the parapet as a student, especially not knowing the social theory that I know now to contradict them. But like, it just struck me as what they were doing was particularly performative, and especially for the sake of resume development. Like, that's really, and I'm wondering if you guys have any comment on that like really a lot of this stuff seems to be so that people can kind of get a job later after college, rather than even to advance a specific ideology that they really believe in.
No, interesting. It's interesting that you said there, Dylan, about that you didn't necessarily have the arguments to counter some of the things that they were saying. I mean, I've heard some things that maybe there should be, just as there's increasingly a compulsory diversity module, maybe we should have a compulsory free speech module, or something that's compulsory for all students when they start, that actually introduces them to the arguments of why free speech is important. Maybe that's also a suggestion. Aaron,
and if I might I add just one thing to that? So we studied like, you know, liberalism as a part of my history degree, but that's not the same thing as studying liberalism as something that existed discretely in the past, which now we've developed beyond, which is pretty much what I was taught. So it wasn't just that I didn't have the social theory to like argue for liberalism, because I did read Hume and Tocqueville and de Tocqueville and stuff like that. but it was sort of the attitude that like these things are no longer sufficient to create the society that is worth having. And that's why there's the recourse to like the post-colonial social justice stuff. Oh, and that was at Seattle University, by the way, if anyone's.
Thank you. Aaron, Fenton, Hewitt?
Hi guys, evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, evening. Yeah, I'll just listening to you guys' comments is quite interesting. What I found is that what I've noticed is that it seems to be more of a cultural shift that's going on, and it seems to be more of a reflection of wider society at large. But part of culture is mindset and what we believe to be right and wrong. The book that I'm going to buy this week it's called The Cooling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And essentially, the book argues that this concept of safetyism, meaning that safetyism means physical well-being, emotional well-being, are sacred. That includes emotional well-being. And so those things are sacred and sacrosanct. And essentially what that means is that you have to protect that at all costs, even at the expense of certain compromises that must be made in order to live in a so many of these people who are on feel that by definition, if you are saying something that invalidates them or who they are, or their experiences, you are the enemy, which justifies in itself a sort of higher educational persecution in that sense. So, for example, you look at what happened to Kathleen Stock a couple of weeks ago when the trans thing, she believes in biological sex, and many transgender people have issues with that. So for me, I think it's more to do with a mindset. It's more to do with what people believe to be right and wrong. Some people believe that emotional well-being is so important that it should trump every other aspect of human life. And that's kind of scary because, unfortunately, in order to live in a society, you kind of have to compromise. You have to hear things that you don't want to hear sometimes. And
yeah,
there's also an aspect of it where identity politics, where identity is a big part of who a lot of people are now. And if you question it in any way, because some people, that's all they have. If you question their identity or who they are as a person, that they can get very protective. I could use a more colorful word than that, but I'm not going to. Okay. But they can get quite protective. So maybe it's to do with less. It's more to do with mindset and more to do with the culture that manifests from that mindset. Okay. In my opinion.
Thank you, Aaron. I think there's an interesting point there because I think identity politics has been raised a few times. Actually, perhaps the response is actually, do we need more universalism, or do we need a stronger, robust civic identity with shared values? And that's a bigger question than maybe one of management or one of students and academics engaging with, discussing with one another in conversations. Perhaps there's been a breakdown of something wider that needs to be cultivated in order for people to be able to trust one another again, or to be able to discuss without, throwing horrendous things with one another. So I think that's an interesting point about identity politics. Harry McKenna?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I do think it is getting worse on campuses. It's the first time in the UK that I've seen it like it is in America. The Kathleen Stock case, it was very similar to the Brett Weinstein's case. It's probably the first time in the UK that I've seen something like that. And I do think academics are fearful, and so students of university admin and the students, but also I think they're fearful of the media. I think so in order to create an incentive for academics to speak out, you need to change the culture within the media, so they're more willing to speak out. But in regard to Charlie's point about should we punish people who, for instance, people who are harassing Kathleen Stock, or should the government intervene? I think, are you really in favour of free speech if you're, if you're deploying those tactics, and you're trying to maybe seems like you're just as bad as them because you're silencing them and you're cancelling them and you're getting them fired, or it just doesn't seem very good optics if you're trying to win the argument or make it seem like you are the ones advocating for free speech and freedom of expression. Also, to Dylan's point, I think a lot of people, as silly as it may sound, a lot of people don't maybe understand the importance of free speech or don't understand what it is. So I think perhaps there needs to be more discussion about why free speech is so important and why it has such value.
No, thank you, Harry. I'll take one more question, then we'll go back to the panel if they want to pick up on anything, then we'll go back for a few more rounds. So Lily Gilbert.
Hi, I just wanted briefly to talk about how I've really noticed this affects the humanities. I'm doing English and philosophy at Leeds, and I've just noticed this complete lack of impartiality on from the lecturers, where I show enthusiasm for an old text and I'm almost scoffed at by not only the teachers but the students, as if to say, oh, but it's problematic. How could you be, or how could you look at this in that light? And I find it ironic because Leeds just released a statement. It's come up with, I think, 5 creeds that it's trying to make people celebrate. One of them is inclusivity, and all I could think is it's inclusivity if, as far as you agree with it. What about, I'm all for hearing voices of people who, really go against the normal grain, and it's just completely shunned because, that would be hurting the feelings of other groups. It's like, how do we have inclusivity, diversity on the one hand, where we're taking into account all these marginalized voices, as they like to say, but at the same time allow opinions that are different to those voices? Because there just seems to be a massive contradiction there. I don't see how those two things can be reconciled.
No, that's a good question. Does anyone, I'll go through the panel again, because I think Lily makes an interesting point, and I think that was touched upon. What happens if the academics support the orthodoxy or are part of or are agreeing with the kind of self-censorship or that happens? How do you really encourage them to support academic freedom if they're pretty much facilitating the diminishing of it? So does anyone from the panel want to pick up on any of the points raised? Charlie?
Yeah, I will answer the question that's been delivered to me by Harry, which is, am I as bad as the censors if I say that we should punish them? No, I don't think I am. The activists are looking to punish you for your ideas. I am saying that we should punish them due to their actions and their kind of tactics of harassment. I think that academic freedom is very important, and that is what I want to defend. Freedom, rights, and liberty are defended through power a lot of the time, and you punish people who attempt to take those rights away from you.
But Charlie, what about some of the examples that people have given in terms of the more subtle forms, such as, people essentially kind of saying, oh, that's problematic, or kind of frowning upon you if you. So that's not harassment, but it's it's these more pernicious, insidious ways which chills free speech, but it's not. It's much more. That's more of a cultural thing.
Yeah, that takes basic argumentation. What I'm talking about is what I think are actually the more threatening and more upfront and kind of life-risking events of free speech and censorship, which are people calling for your life to be ruined. That, I think, is actually a bit more damaging than people saying, I don't think you should say that. There's a difference between I don't think you should say that, which is bad and can be tackled through culture, I agree, and I don't think you should say that, therefore you should lose your job. That can be tackled through both culture and through some power.
So, Dr. Nathan, do you want to pick up?
Well, yeah, it was just on that I wanted to chip in. On this, I am agreed with Charlie. It's very, very clear that a university or any organization has a moral right to act in the face of abusive intolerance. Whether it's good to act in punitive ways, that's a different matter. So I think you have a moral right to do it, but I just think you should try, especially with younger people and especially in an atmosphere where people have been led to believe it's all right, we should give them a chance, cut them enough slack so that they can have a conversation. We'll find out if they really do want to pursue that line of intolerance. But absolutely, if they pursue that line of abusive intolerance, yeah, don't cut them any more slack. You have a moral right to penalize.
And what about some of the other points that have been raised, such as what Lily said about, this kind of negative pressure, this kind of more subtle negative pressure to not toe, if you don't toe the line, as you will. Do you have any sense of how that can be responded to? Dr. Neil or Professor Ellie? What?
Sorry, that was me. Sorry, I thought you were asking Ellie. So yeah, on the soft censorship, I think that's why I'm so keen on conversation on the soft censorship. That's the really big enemy. I mean, thankfully, even though things have, I agree, gotten an awful lot worse, it's incredibly rare still to have a really bad outburst of abusive censorious attacks on an individual. Most people are censored by things like somebody just saying, "Oh, that's a bit problematic." But most people are led into self-censorship by much softer kinds of attacks, and the only weapon against those you have is reasonable argument. You make it clear that if you just say, "Oh, that's problematic," well, that's late. You need a better argument than that. Or if you accuse somebody of racism, even it's in a very mild and indirect way, you better explain what you mean by that and what's wrong and how they should change their behavior.
Ellie, did you want to...
good fashion.
Oh, cool. Ellie?
Yeah. Yes. I very much agree with the way that Neil presented it around how universities should respond to students behaving very badly. And it's entirely within the lines of within the remit of the morality that needs to underpin higher education, to get people to understand the way you then have to conduct yourself if you're part of a university. But I mean, my point is that I think that's down to the people that work in universities to make this happen rather than some external body. The points that Lily raises, I think, are really important. I mean, policies which purport to be inclusive and diverse are really the opposite. That's my experience of them, and I think that's the way they that's the way they operate. They're really cliquish. They're based on only validating people who've learned a particular language or a particular form of argument and form of thought. And so they're exclusivist and issue diversity of opinion. And, it's an interesting thing for people to explain why this doublespeak has emerged. In terms of what's happened within the humanities, and I think also in vast areas of the social sciences as well, it is a real problem because clearly, I mean, there's plenty of my colleagues who are very much operate in the way that Lily describes in terms of what they think, the way they argue, and how they see their role as getting people to think in the right way, rather than as being to help people understand how you think and how you work out problems. And it is a really genuine problem within academic life. The only thing that I can say is that those of us who don't look at it that way have to explain why we don't, and create alternative options for students with what courses are like. But it's a real problem, and I think that, I mean, I experience it generationally. So the people who tend to see things more the way I do tend to be, at least 45 or older. Younger people coming into academic life, I experience as being kind of acculturated into this kind of way of thinking. I don't know if other people find it that way. But I mean, I think, you know, obviously it opens up a whole load of discussion about what you do about the way education works in school, you know, what happens earlier on. But it is a very big problem, because if you think about what it's going to be like 20 years down the road, if people don't start trying to do something different, then yeah, there's a very big problem.
It's interesting you've mentioned about education, because we actually have Hayden here, who set up a freedom of speech group for school kids. And it'd be really interesting to hear, I mean, do you, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, Hayden, but do you think this is a problem that actually starts quite early, before people get to university, that you feel that there are kind of free speech issues? What do you make of this, Hayden?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, be a bit louder though.
Okay, so yeah, my opinion is that freedom of speech has to be taught very young, because in secondary schools at the moment, we're seeing quite a big uprising.
But speak a bit, if you could speak a bit louder, Hayden, just, yeah, speak louder.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So I believe that right now in schools, we're taught we're taught what to think, sorry, not how to think, from quite a young age. And we're never really taught about freedom of speech and how to use your rights of freedom of speech. So, you know, my campaign, we really, our aim at the moment is to reach as many school kids as we can and teach them, you know, as many rights as we can. We want to teach them how exciting it is to have these rights. And especially my school, I've been through a very big thing with my freedom of speech being infringed. And instead of putting me down, that just encouraged me more. And, you know, so far, the campaign has been going very well. We've had good success. We've got 7 members now, all across the UK, and we're picking up, and we're just waiting to get out into, you know, doing speeches and stuff. And I do think it starts at a very young age, and I think that, you know, grasping it at a very young age is very important. So yeah, I guess.
I have a question for you, Hayden, but some people might, the counter argument to you is that actually school kids, that's not necessarily the time when there should be, you know, expressing loads of views. They should actually be listening to what their teachers say. And so do you see that attention there, that actually kids at school should be actually just following the rules of their teachers and not necessarily critiquing or like challenging the things that they're saying?
Well, I think it's important to learn. It's important to take in what your teachers are saying, but it's also important to challenge what your teachers are saying as well, because dialogue and expression of your views is extremely important. And if we stop using that and teaching that in schools, we're not, you know, society isn't going to grow in any good way. So, you know, to get it at a young age, because although it might seem like students don't express views in school, they do. Like just little things like, I mean, there's been a massive thing in my school with LGBTQ, you know, students expressing their views on that side. But, you know, I've got quite a few people I know that have challenged something like the non-binary issue and have got, you know, internally excluded and punished for things like that. But they can be, you know, called horrible names and misogynist, racist, homophobe, whatever they want. And the other people don't get anything. So, you know, there's an equal balance that needs to be taught, and, you know, getting those students to know their rights will help them in life further on from school as well.
Oh, thank you for sharing your experience. Feel free to put the link to your campaign group in the chat, Hayden, and great work that you're doing, kind of supporting free speech amongst your age group. So we've got 10 minutes left. We'll quickly go through the questions. Please keep them short, and also really focus for the last 10 minutes on how we can act and what we can do. So yeah, I'm going to go to Sophie.
Great, thank you. I guess I just wanted to draw out the theme that I think has been coming up in the last few contributions, which is that we don't really make a positive argument for free speech or for academic freedom or even liberal democracy. We make this negative argument where we criticize the outcomes of identity politics and cancellation, but we're quite hesitant about kind of actively advocating, what we're defending. And I don't know whether that comes from the wonderful tradition we have in the West of sort of, secularism, post-enlightenment, and keeping institutions and values relatively separate, or whether it's actually the result of the deconstruction over the last few years of British values and Western values and all the rest. But either way, that's the situation we're in. So I was really struck by what Dylan and what Harry said about this. And I think in the context of an increasingly kind of anti-democratic turn in the international community, it would be brilliant if we could maybe try and bring in those positive arguments that we're missing and bring them into institutions like universities. And I guess I wondered what the panelists think about that as a solution, and to what extent we can bring those formally into institutions without infringing on the sort of objectivity that they have.
No, great points. We'll whiz through the Sharon and Paul. Sharon, do you wanna?
Hi, thank you. I just wonder if in some sense we aren't through the looking glass on this, because I think it goes a bit beyond, are we free to disagree? There are shibboleths that we are forced to utter that are abject lies. And I know that sounds quite accusatory, so I mean it though, I'll back it up. I mean, the idea that biological sex doesn't exist, or the acknowledgement of biological sex, if you were to phrase it in one particular way or another, is often regarded as transphobic. For whatever reason, we seem to have to pretend that Sir David Ames was murdered by an internet troll. I find that difficult to believe. There are just fundamental diversions between reality and lies that we are forced not only to accept, but to tell in polite society. And it's too far. And if you live in a society where people are forced to lie, where they are compelled over and over to lie in order to maintain their good standing, I think we're in a far worse position than we realize.
No, thank you. Very powerful, Sharon. And also, finally, Paul.
Thanks. I wanted to say I agree with a lot of what Charlie said tonight. And yeah, I think we shouldn't underestimate just how bad the situation is on universities. And if we're going to speak about a silent majority of students, I don't think we should have any illusion and think that they might be on the side of people who are pro freedom of speech or pro academic freedom. In my experience, the people who are quiet very much have the same fundamental assumptions as those who want to restrict speech, and they will never actually side with people who are pro freedom. If they are forced to pick a side, they will side with those who want to restrict it. And I think we can actually draw a distinction between authoritarianism and legitimate government authority. I think a government is entirely within its right to enforce that which it sees as the common good, when defined as that which reinforces that which we think is good for our civilization. I think we're right to say that freedom of speech is something which is good in this civilization, and our government therefore has a right to legislate in favor of it. And I do not think at all that all makes us as bad as the people who want to cancel, because just because we're pro freedom, we shouldn't say that, we shouldn't fall into a moral relativism and say all ideas are the same. There are good ideas and bad ideas. We should prioritize good ones over bad ones and punish people who want to harass or impose themselves and their ideas on other people.
Yeah, no, well, but we do also know what governments, when they say delineate what's the greater good and impose it on everyone. So I think that's also a danger in opening that up for designating what is good for everyone. Whether that's whatever policies, identity politics, and then everyone kind of has to accept that. So that could be a counter argument to that as well. Dylan, did you want to say something quickly, in 1 minute?
Yeah. I mean, I was only going to, you took the words out of my mouth, honestly. The question is really like, is it the government that you want to have moral authority? Like, is that really who you want to invest with the ability to make these really important cultural decisions? Or is this something that like simply can be handled by people?
Great. So closing statements now for what in 1 minute from our panelists. Pick up on anything that's said. And I guess it would be great to just say what both picking up and then what you really think that we could do now to take back control of our campuses. Professor Ellie.
Well, I certainly don't think that there's any immediate solution to a lot of these problems. It's not like, we do certain things and next month everything's going to be okay. I mean, if you look at the problem of education and the crisis of education, and you read somebody like Hannah Arendt and what she was writing decades ago, this is there's a long-term problem here, which is pretty deep-seated within educational systems. I think that the first thing that we can do, therefore, is to recognise that and to try and understand that better, to accept the extent to which at the moment there is a war going on against the Enlightenment and its values. I mean, that is happening more or less self-consciously verbalized and articulated and pushed forwards, in some areas very self-consciously done so. So I mean, we have got to really see what we're up against here, but I think it is down to people who see that to then act in their own right. I mean, I really believe that very strongly, and I think at the same time as recognizing the difficulties, one of the things is, and as I say again, I think that where this has to start is with academic staff, is people can sometimes overestimate the difficulties of just saying something, making a defense of others, arguing your case. It's very easy to not do it because you feel scared, but unless you do it, you don't know exactly what it is you're trying to be scared of. And I think more people just need to start doing that, where they recognize the problem. And if other people want to, I mean, I don't trust the government at all to sort this out myself. I think it really is our responsibility.
And thank you, Ellie and Dr. Nilfin.
So I'd like to pick up on what Sophie just said. We shouldn't get too stuck on the negative campaigning against censorious people. We need to do that sometimes to defend ourselves, but it's much more fun and much more life enhancing to celebrate the free speech that we actually do, thankfully, most of us enjoy most of the time. So let's do that by showing that curiosity and open-minded conversations are just more fun. And just a final comment on that, I'd just like to celebrate the fact that we have Alan Sokal here, who I'm old enough to remember what fantastic fun he gave a whole generation of us in taking the piss out of postmodernist bullshitters, but then patiently explaining what was so wrong about what they were doing. Now, they weren't a censorious and dangerous mob, but they certainly did a lot of harm in academia. And by poking fun at them, but in a constructive way, he was justifiably, was and still is a folk hero. So thank you, Alan, for coming along tonight. And thank you all for organizing this event.
Thank you. And Charlie, do you want to say your closing statements?
Absolutely. I'll take the questions in order very quickly and then a brief summary. So Sophie, about making the positive case for freedom and freedom of speech, absolutely agree. I think Ellie did a brilliant job at the beginning of this discussion talking about how university makes you a better person, or at least it should, and how discussion and the melting of new ideas and new people can make you into a better person, more enlightened and more thoughtful and more agreeable. And I think that is incredibly important and something we need. And then Paul, on authority, legitimate authority, I completely agree. And the great thing about kind of imposing freedom on all people is they get to choose what they want to do with it afterwards. And when you do that, you can support it, which is very, very important. Dylan, you're from Seattle, so you have the First Amendment, which is really jolly brilliant. And I wish we had it too. Unfortunately, we don't. Inaya is right to note in the comments that America is having its own free speech crisis on campus. And indeed it is, except while only we can fight against these problems through the cultural lens, Americans can fight back through a cultural and a practical lens. They can employ lawyers who can defend their First Amendment rights. We cannot do that. If we are pushed out of an institution or silenced or censored, we have very few avenues of practical recourse. And so what I'm in favor of is, of course, fighting the good fight, trying to win people over to our perspective. But also I want a strong horse to lead the way for freedom. And that strong horse is generally government that upholds liberties and freedoms through power. So yes, that's me.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. But I will also remind everyone of Brett Weinstein and Peter Boghossian, and that that is also happening in America, and Peter Boghossian in the last month, really, that happened to. And closing statement, Sam.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to end on a more positive, a positive note before recognizing that yes, perhaps things are getting worse. Earlier on, Charlie said, I think that, yeah, we're seeing more restrictions on speech. You know, I was looking at Edinburgh University's equality, diversity and inclusion area of the website, and there's something called a micro-invalidation, an example of which is saying to a person of colour that, quote, anyone can succeed if they work hard enough. So yes, you know, what we are seeing is this rise of so-called opaque language, the word problematic. You know, what does that actually mean? I challenge everyone here this evening, next time they hear someone say problematic, that's problematic, ask them, you know, what do you actually mean by that? Is it racist? Is it homophobic? And then maybe, you know, that will move them to actually think a little bit deeper about what they're trying to argue. But, you know, on the positive side, you know, things may be getting worse, but also I think we are managing to shift the conversation. You know, Free Speech Champions as an organization, we've been around for 9 months or so now, and really promoting conversations such as these. And we're experiencing a pouring out of young people coming to us on university campuses and in schools who recognize this problem and want to do something about it. So yeah, here's to that. Thank you for all coming.
Thank you. And before we close, I mean, Professor Sokol, do you have any words that you'd be up for sharing just for a couple minutes? It'd be great to hear your perspective on some of the issues that have been raised today, and what you think could be done.
Well, I feel bad about closing. I don't want to be the last, but I did want to make a comment about the idea of punishing people. Let's take, for example, the students who campaigned against Kathleen Stock, okay? I think that was disgusting and immoral, but I think it's very dangerous for us to try to use the harassment laws to punish them. I mean, first of all, the definition of harassment in the Equality Act is very vague and subjective. And if we start using it against them, they're going to start using it against us. And we're setting a very, very bad precedent. And also, I think if we try to pursue them on those grounds, they're going to simply say, look, you want freedom of speech for yourself, but not for us. And I think that's also bad to give them the opportunity to say that. Instead, we should force them to defend their substantive line. So I think if I had been the Vice Chancellor of Sussex University, which of course I never will be, and would never want to be. But if I were, I would have said what he said in defending Kathleen Stock's academic freedom, but I would have said more. I would have said, look, you have the perfect legal right to campaign for her to be fired, provided you do that peacefully and without personally harassing her. But you do not have the moral right to misrepresent what she says, because of course what those people did was completely misrepresent what she says, calling her a transphobe, which is completely the opposite of what she is. And so I think the discussion should have been focused on the substantive issue of how her opponents had completely distorted her point of view and set her up, I can't say a straw man, a straw woman, to attack her. And I think that's the grounds that we should fight on. We should fight on the substantive issue, and we should be very wary of trying to use the harassment laws against our opponents, because they can backfire.
Thank you so much. Many fascinating opinions and ideas put forward tonight. Thank you so much. If you are a student, if you are a young person, if you are someone in school who cares about these issues, please, please, please join the Free Speech Champions Project. We are growing every single day, and you will meet lots of like-minded young people from fascinating, interesting, curious backgrounds that are doing great things to take this issue forward. And I do think this struggle, this fight can be won, and it just takes us to actually stand up and do something, to speak up if someone's being misrepresented, to speak up if someone's being, completely smeared. And if someone, as Sam said, if they're saying something's problematic, what do you mean by that? I'll encourage people to justify their arguments and really say no to this. So thank you everyone for joining tonight. Thank you so much to our brilliant panel, but many forthright opinions. And thank you for the amazing audience and the great questions. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening, and let's keep up the fight. Thank you.